Good evening. I'm going to try to call things to order. Thank you for being here. All right. Thank you all. Okay. I feel very tall. They gave me a stool to stand on this time. Can you hear me okay? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. All right. Okay, well, I want to wish you all a good evening. It is so wonderful to see so many faces here tonight. Thank you for braving the really cold weather and being here with us. I want to start by saying, if you haven't seen the awesome pop-up exhibit in the back on John Lewis, please check that out before you go. And I want to thank Ms. Yvonne Hill, who came from Northport, near Fort Myers. She brought it with her to share with us. So thank you, Ms. Hill. Thank you so much. My name is Julie Matus. I'm the fairly new executive director with the Boxer Diversity Initiative. I've been in my role for about 8 months now. And it's just been amazing to be, a part of this organization and this community, and to just see how wonderful this community is when it comes to supporting small nonprofits like the Boxer Diversity Initiative. We thank you so much for supporting us by showing up to our programs, by telling your friends and neighbors about us, and certainly by your generosity in donations that you give. So thank you so much. I want to also recognize some young people that we have here tonight. You may have heard about a program that we have that we started this fall. It launched in October. It's called Bending the Arc. We got, thanks to generous funding from the Barancic Foundation, we were able to put together a program that is about 6 months long that is designed for high school students in Sarasota and Manatee counties. And we have 24 outstanding high school students who are on this journey with us to learn about the civil rights movement. And their journey is going to culminate in a week-long trip to Alabama to visit civil rights landmarks. Yes. So we just could not be more proud of them. They're fantastic, and if you ever get a chance to speak with them, please take that opportunity. You're going to see them at our upcoming programs, but I want to ask you all, stand real quickly and be recognized so we can see your faces. Thank you. They're fantastic. This is our future, and the future's bright, really. So tonight's program is actually the second in a series that we're doing that focuses on the civil rights movement. And we put together this series based on a theme, really in large part to support the journey of our young people, but also to open up important conversations with our community about this pivotal era in history. So last month we did a program in conjunction with SAC that explored local African American history focused on the civil rights era. This is the second one, and we have 3 more coming up, and we really hope to see you. The next program is January 23rd, and it's going to be held here at 6 p.m. And the program features a Harvard historian, who's a distinguished historian, Dr. Timothy Patrick McCarthy, who's going to facilitate a panel discussion that explores how the civil rights movement has influenced other social justice movements, from disability rights to LGBTQ to Hispanic, Latino rights. So it's going to be a wonderful, spirited conversation, and we hope to see you. In February and March, we are featuring programs with 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning authors. Gilbert King, who wrote Devil in the Grove, is in February 13th. And March 6th is our final program with Jonathan Eig, who wrote King, A Life, which just won the Pulitzer in 2024. So that program will be held at the Arsenault Theater. So check our website, and if you're not signed up for our newsletter, please do. We hope to see you. So I want to say thank you to our partner, the Unitarian Universalists of Sarasota. They have been wonderful in supporting us by hosting our programs, not only this one, but the lynching memorial marker, the soil collection ceremony. They've been so generous. They've been wonderful allies. I want to welcome Reverend Wallen to the lectern, just to give a welcome.
And really, let's hear for the Boxer. Dan Boxer, I know you're here somewhere. And Julie, right there, thank you. They make this community so much better. I'm Reverend Jay Wool. I'm the settled minister here at the Unitarian Universalists of Sarasota. We are thrilled to be co-sponsoring this event. Since we have a number of visitors here who may not know anything about Unitarian Universalism, this is my one time to say it. So let me share that Unitarian Universalism encourages an open-ended search for meaning in life and a commitment to asking our values to shape our actions, which is one reason why we are always open our doors for events like this. We are a pluralistic religion that draws wisdom from many sources. We welcome all people in our beloved community of whatever age, race, class, ethnicity, physical ability, sexual orientation, gender identity, or religious background. Racial justice has always been a personal ministry for me, as well as for this congregation and Unitarian Universalism. We have spilled blood for this. We are constantly looking for ways to partner with the community as we work to continue to build the beloved community. The path to justice is always hard and never linear, but take courage, my friends. You are not alone. We have each other, and we must care for each other in the days ahead, as it will become more challenging. So let us be there for each other in whatever ways that we can. Thank you, and enjoy the presentation, Tim.
Thank you, Reverend Wallen. I also want to say that the Boxer Diversity Initiative, way long before I came on board, when Dan and Lytton Boxer began this organization 15 years ago. They've been doing amazing things for 15 years, incredible things. In large part, they were able to do what they've done over the years with the support of the Community Foundation of Sarasota County. We're so proud and grateful to the Community Foundation for being our presenting sponsor for this series that we're doing. And they have just been amazing to work with, and their support, their funding has enabled us to put this program on. And it's my pleasure to introduce Kirsten Russell, who's the Vice President of Community Impact with the Community Foundation, to say a couple words. Thank you.
Wow, thank you all for being here tonight. I am not the person you came to hear from, so I will make this quick. But I do want to say Julie did a great job and always does a great job of acknowledging the students. And I would just encourage everyone to find some time to talk to one of the students, because I got a moment before this to get a little snippet of what you're going to experience tonight. But their questions, where they are in life, how they're thinking, they just heard pretty much you can change the world. And the only thing that's stopping you is you. So I would just encourage you to take a minute tonight to talk to these amazing minds, because all the money in the world that sponsors them to do this, it's still the time and the thought and the commitment that they're making to learn, just like all of you being here today. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge, especially from the youngest people in the room. So I hope that you will do that. Tonight, we're going to hear about John Lewis's work, his life work, the quest for the beloved community, a society based on equity and inclusion. I think that's why we're all here today, because that's what we believe in. We learn about John Lewis and the concept of the beloved community. This mission will feel familiar to all of us, I hope. The pursuit of a community that holds the core values of equity and inclusion is one that is at the heart of the Boxer Diversity Initiative, which is why we have come alongside them, and all of you have come alongside the work that they do, because it's something that we believe in at the core. It's a very noble goal, and one that can feel elusive, especially as we recognize the divisive historical moment we live in today, some 60 years after John Lewis began getting into good trouble for the cause of uniting the divided nation that characterized and gave rise to the civil rights era. Still, elusive as it may feel, the significance of the endeavor, which is why the Community Foundation and all of you it's so important that we're here today and we support this work. With equity, inclusion as the base, other deeply held values can be achieved, values of justice and freedom, opportunities for all. These are the central focus of so many of us, and it aligns with why we're here today. Tonight, we're here to learn about an iconic advocate of civil rights. There's no doubt that we'll be inspired by the grit and courage that propelled John Lewis. We believe that John Lewis's beloved community is achievable, and that the Boxer Diversity Initiative, through bringing renowned historians and thought leaders that we're going to hear from tonight, is really a key player in our community, promoting empathy and respect that nourishes these ideals. These ideals fuel each of us individually, committing to a community, creating a community where there is opportunity and dignity are available for all that call this place home, now and for generations to come. So thank you so much for being here tonight. I think we're in for a real treat, and we are just really proud to be here and helping to make this possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten, for your words. We're grateful. Okay, I just want to tell you a little bit about kind of the structure of tonight's program. Dr. Arsenault is going to give a talk that provides some historical context. He is then going to be joined in conversation with Judge Charles Williams. We're going to have opportunities for questions from the audience, and then after the talk, Dr. Arsenault was gracious enough to offer to stay to sign books, and we have a few for sale. It's going to be right outside the door here. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Judge Charles Williams. The Honorable Charles E. Williams is a judge for the 12th Judicial Circuit Court of Florida here in Sarasota. I know many of you know him. He's near and dear to the Boxer Diversity Initiative. He sits on our board of directors for many, many years. I don't think we would be able to do what we do without his support and involvement. So we're so grateful to him, and I'm going to hand it over. Please give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Dr. Arsenault, and I may code switch into Ray because I've known him so long, and he can call me Charles in case he forgets. But I've known him I think at least 25 years, maybe. Both of us have a fondness for St. Petersburg, Florida, which he calls his home. And so I've had an opportunity whenever I go up there to have an opportunity sometimes to visit with him. But Dr. Raymond Arsenault is an American historian and academic scholar. He has taught at the University of South Florida, where he is the John Hope Franklin Professor of Southern History, emeritus. He is the author of several award-winning books on civil rights history. In addition to the book that he will be speaking on tonight, John Lewis, In Search of the Beloved Community, he has authored The Freedom Riders, 1961, and The Struggle for Racial Justice, which became the basis of the CBS documentary series on the same subject. Included in his works are The Sound of Freedom, Marian Anderson, the Lincoln Memorial, and the concert that changed America, and Arthur Ashe, A Life. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Raymond Arsenault. Dr.
I think I've spoken from such a high, I feel like I'm in the pulpit. I guess I am, huh? I want to thank all of you for coming. I have spent most of this year going around the country talking about John Lewis. The book came out in January, and it's been pretty much nonstop since then. And I'm not complaining because I feel it's a privilege to talk about John. He was a personal friend, a colleague. I knew him for 20 years, and I don't know that I ever met anyone like him. I can say that, I think, without fear of contradiction, that I'm not sure what makes a great human being, but if there are great human beings, he was certainly one of them. And it's particularly, I think, appropriate to be giving this talk tonight, on the day of Jimmy Carter's funeral. I'm sure many of you watched at least part of it. I needed a box of Kleenex myself. I thought it was so poignant and so impressive. And some of the eulogies and the words about President Carter were very reminiscent of John Lewis. I remember one of them said of President Carter that he had a tough mind and a tender heart. A tough mind and a tender heart. And that, for me, really sums up John Lewis, but of course also Jimmy Carter. That there were so many parallels in terms of their belief in kind of moral dignity, integrity, commitment to a long struggle for freedom and liberation. I know that, of course, John Lewis worked in the Carter administration for a while. They didn't always agree, but I know John Lewis had great respect for Jimmy Carter, in part because his friend, of course, Andy Young, you may have seen him there today, who's another person I've gotten to know pretty well. And I thought he was particularly impressive. He can barely stand now. He's 92, almost 93, and it must have been tough on him to do that today. But boy, did he bring his A game, didn't he? It was extraordinary. So I've done a number of books on civil rights. I decided maybe 25 years ago, more than that actually, 30 years ago, that I was going to devote the rest of my career to this. Kind of a personal quest, I guess. Early in my life, I wrote about Southern demagogues, these wild and woolly political characters from the backwoods South, sort of racist folk heroes, you might call them. They were interesting, and one of my friends said I was the world's only demogographer, not a demographer, but a demogographer. So many demagogues, so little time, But at some point, I decided I was going to go back to my first love, which was civil rights history. I wanted to recapture some of the lost stories of some of the most heroic people in our society, people who changed all of our lives. Some of them have never appeared in the index of a book. Certainly John Lewis has, but there are many other sort of foot soldiers of the movement. In fact, John himself sort of thought of himself in those terms. He didn't really seek leadership, He was one of these leaders, after everybody else is gone, he's sweeping up. No task was too mundane for him. He was almost too good to be true. In fact, I've often told my friends that being in the presence of the Freedom Riders and others can make you feel like you're never doing enough. Feel a little guilty, to say the least, right? But nobody could make me feel as guilty as John Lewis could. He didn't do it on purpose. I just never felt I could really live up to his standards. Let me give you an example of which will always be maybe the most memorable moment I had with John. We were on the Oprah show together in 2011. It was thrilling, I think my colleagues' reaction, I think I could have won a Nobel Prize and they wouldn't have been more excited. I didn't quite understand that, but they made a American Experience film based on my book, Freedom Riders, and Stanley Nelson, who's this extraordinary filmmaker, sometimes called the Black Ken Burns. Stanley's incredible, and I worked with him for 3 years, and the film, I think, I'm really proud of it. It won 3 Emmys, and a George Peabody. We got to go to the Emmys and to Sundance and all that. It's kind of very, very glittery. But Oprah saw the film on a DVD, and 15 minutes later, she called Stanley Nelson, the filmmaker, and crying into the phone, saying, I never knew this story. I mean, she probably should have, because her father, who's a barber in Nashville, has many of the former Freedom Riders as his clients. So she had met Freedom Riders, but she somehow missed the heart of the story, and so she felt embarrassed. She was winding up her show, and she only had 4 shows left, and she called Stanley and said, I've got to do one of the 4, and I'm going to bring in every living Freedom Rider at my expense and their families, and she did it. And of course, it was the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Riders, which were in May of 1961. So it was incredible. There were 180 Freedom Riders in the audience, and at one point, the producers asked both me and Stanley, but Oprah was looking for a reconciliation story. She always liked that. She thought maybe the Freedom Rider story would be kind of too dark for a national audience. So she said, "Well, have you got a reformed Klansman? Somebody who used to be with the Klan, but now they're pro-civil rights." And so, we said, as a matter of fact, we do. There's a man named Elwyn Wilson, who in 1961 was a young Klansman in Rock Hill, South Carolina. That was the first act of violence on the original Freedom Ride, which was going from Washington to New Orleans, and then never made it past Birmingham. And that's why other people came in to sort of bail them out, and why there were eventually more than 60 Freedom Rides. So Mr. Wilson was about 23, 24 at the time, and he was part of this kind of gang of young thugs. And they met the Freedom Riders at the bus station in Rock Hill. It was a pretty tough town if you've ever been there, kind of a mill town, big Klan, Clavern. And he beat John up and 2 of the other Freedom Riders, and pretty badly, actually. That was John's first major beating. He ultimately had 45 beatings in his career. I was telling the students earlier that after he lost his hair in his later years, you could see on his head every mark where he'd been hit by a billy club or a cattle prod or something. He sort of wore these scars as kind of a badge of honor, I guess. But anyway, Mr. Wilson was the first one who beat him up. So Mr. Wilson went on and he found religion, he got married, he had children, became a different person. He left the Klan, And he always felt guilty about what he'd done to John Lewis that day. So fast forward many years, 2009, President Barack Obama's first inauguration. Some of you may remember, maybe some of you were there, but on TV you could see John Lewis sitting right behind where he was being sworn in, as big as life. And so Mr. Wilson saw that, and that gave him the idea of calling John in his office in Washington and apologizing. So that's what he did, and I think he was shocked that John was the kind of congressman that you could literally, he'd pick up the phone if nobody else would. You know, he was very kind of proactive, and anyway, he answered the phone, and Mr. Wilson's crying over the phone, saying, I'm so sorry. I don't know that John even remembered who this guy was, but he's just making this confession and saying, I'm so sorry, can you ever forgive me? I don't know what I was thinking. I was a different person then. Please forgive me. Well, John Lewis was all about forgiveness. That was maybe the central component of his philosophy, his forgiveness. And pretty soon they're crying with each other and praying over the phone. And I think with a lot of people, that would have been the end of it, but not with John. So he invites Mr. Wilson up to Washington to meet him in his office. Kind of a come-to-Jesus meeting. And once again, they're praying and crying together, and they became friends. You know, amazing. And so when Oprah needed a reconciliation story, we trotted out Mr. Wilson, and he reluctantly agreed to come on. I mean, you have to think about this poor guy. He's now in his 70s, ill health, 180 freedom riders surrounded him, you know. We assured him they're all into forgiveness. Nobody would hurt him, and but he was just terrified. I was sitting next to John. I was off camera. There's John's here, and then Mr. Wilson on the other side. So I had a ringside seat to see what was going on. So Oprah asks Mr. Wilson her first question, and nothing comes out. You could see he was terrified. So she sort of gulped and asked a second question, and he was even more terrified this time. And you could see he was going to bolt from the stage. He was just about to implode. He was terrified. You know, probably 20 million people watching this show. And amazingly, at that moment, John reached out with his left hand and grabbed Mr. Wilson's right hand and said in a loud voice that everybody could hear in the studio, "He's my brother." And with that simple phrase, I mean, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, really. I mean, it was an extraordinary act of compassion and forgiveness and just love. And Mr. Wilson somehow got up with the courage to stay on the stage and say a few things, and he died about 2 years later. But he had his day, you know, his sense of somehow making up for what he had done when he was a young man. And for me, that'll always be the quintessential John Lewis, that day when he did that act of compassion and generosity and just love for a man who had beaten him savagely many years before. But that's who John Lewis was, you know. I mean, he always had his eyes on the prize. Of all the civil rights leaders, I mean, there were many great ones, and who were also deeply committed to nonviolence and the search for the beloved community. But I don't know if there was anyone who, like John, who never wavered. You know, and in fact, it's amazing that he of all the civil rights leaders was the one who made the transition from protest to politics. Bayard Rustin, you may have seen the recent film on Rustin that was the Obamas produced. I didn't like it very much, frankly, but I'm glad that at least I did a film on Rustin. He was an extraordinary character, a kind of Gandhian sage who planned the March on Washington, who had really changed the Montgomery bus boycott in the 50s. He was incredible, but to many people's surprise, in 1965, he wrote an essay called From Protest to Politics. And what he was suggesting in that essay, which got a lot of attention, was it was time for the civil rights movement to move out of the streets and sort of into the political establishment, to try to get elected, to try to have an impact on policy, to fight both from outside and inside. And people were surprised that Rustin suggested this, because he'd always been the leader of kind of organizing protests. But now he's saying, okay, we got to make the transition. And of all the people who did it successfully, John is the most obvious one. I mean, Jesse Jackson ran for president. Of course, he never won. There were a few others, but John had a very distinguished and long career in Congress. And I don't think you could have predicted that when he was a young man, because there was a time when the Kennedy administration was terrified that the South was going to erupt into a civil war, that there was going to be increased violence. And so they thought, let's get these kids like John Lewis out of the streets, and let's have them do voting rights. That won't be as controversial, they thought. They were wrong. They said, let's just go and do voting rights, you know? And so they got Harry Belafonte to be the kind of the go-between to bring foundation money to offer it to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, if they would change their focus from nonviolent direct action to voting rights. And John was against that. He was very suspicious. He thought they were being bribed, almost being blackmailed to doing it. And he was one of the ones who didn't want to take that money. They finally decided to split SNCC into two parts, a voting rights part and a nonviolent direct action. In fact, Bernard Lafayette, who was John Lewis's roommate in college and is still alive at 84 and still an extraordinary civil rights leader, came up with the idea, well, even a bird needs two wings to fly. So SNCC now had two wings, right? But John was not associated with the voting rights. It's ironic that he later became the most famous voting rights advocate in American history. I mean, he came to really believe in voting rights, but he was a man of action. That's what he liked to think of himself. I mean, he was also a man of ideas, and a man of words, but he really thought he was primarily a man of action. He thought you had to turn ideas into action. You couldn't let up. You know, you had to keep momentum in the civil rights movement, and he was always pushing for that, yet in an incredibly polite and humanistic way. I mean, there was never a real sense of anger. I mean, I think he had fire in his belly, for sure, and to fight for civil rights, but he was always polite, even to the worst of his enemies, you know. And so he really came to believe that voting rights was incredibly important, and headed up the voter education project for several years. And after he was sort of kicked out of SNCC in 1966 by Stokely Carmichael, SNCC started moving away from interracialism, away from nonviolence, and most of the principles that it was founded in 1960. And John was still their director, but finally the center wouldn't hold, and he seemed like a historical anachronism, really, a kind of a holdover from the early days, and people were moving towards black power, towards an emphasis on power relationships and kind of forcing social change. And John was all for social change, believe me, but he never liked to scare people into doing it. He was really much more into persuasion and setting examples for other people, the way to live their lives. I mean, he was totally, almost obsessed with the beloved community. And he would preach it to anybody who would listen. You know, he grew up in this tiny rural area, Pike County, Alabama, born in 1940, absolute desperate poverty. One of 10 children, no running water, no electricity, no paved roads, no indoor plumbing, none of that. And somehow he pulled himself out of that to have an impact on not only the United States, but in some ways the world. So it's an amazing story, the trajectory of his life, not just the conversion from protest to politics, where he serves 34 years in Congress, but that he was able to keep his head through it all. I mean, you have to do certain pragmatic things to survive in politics, right? But he I'm sure he recognized that, but he saw himself as a kind of personification of the civil rights movement, the continuation of it. He wanted to bring it to Congress. As you may know, he led several sit-ins in Congress, in the halls of Congress. He was arrested 5 times as a congressman. You know, he's always getting arrested. And, but he felt so strongly that he had to be one of the foot soldiers. He couldn't expect other people to assume the burden, to do something that he wouldn't do. And I saw him in so many situations where he always seemed to make the right decision. I'm sure he made some mistakes, obviously. I talked about some of them in the book, but one example is in 1968, in April, the night Dr. King is assassinated in Memphis, John was in Indianapolis, Indiana, working on the Bobby Kennedy campaign. Bobby Kennedy was, of course, running for the presidency, and he was going to make a big speech in the inner city in Indianapolis that night. And then he heard that King had been assassinated. John had planned all this for him had a big crowd, almost all black. And so John counseled him on the speech he should give. And it's amazing, of all the American cities that went up in flames that night, Indianapolis was not one of them. You know, they implored these people to not act in anger or vengeance, frustration, but go home and you'll have your day. So, but after that, there was a very fine white Southern journalist, very liberal, progressive, named Fred Powledge, did some wonderful books on civil rights. And Powledge was there interviewing John. And Powledge just lost it after he heard about King's assassination. And he just started raging, saying, why is it always us who get the bullet in the brain? Why are we the ones who are being gunned down? Maybe we should start gunning down some of them. And John just cut him off, just cut him to the quick and said, Fred, I don't want to ever hear you say anything like that again. The world does not need more hate. I know you're frustrated, I know you're angry, so am I, but that kind of rhetoric is only going to make things worse. And it's interesting to me that John didn't have to think about it. You know, it was immediate. He cut Fred Powledge off and sort of took the high road. And he always seemed to be able to do that in so many different situations. I think that's why people so respected him so much, that he was a politician really like no other that I know of, who could keep the best ideals of the freedom struggle and never waver, and yet somehow represent his constituents in Atlanta and really bring things back to them. I was thinking today about when Jimmy Carter was being discussed. Between 1981 and 86, John was on this Atlanta City Council, and Andy Young, his friend, was the mayor. Well, Andy Young was a very shrewd politician, and he was working out a deal with these local contractors to build the roads to the new Carter Center. But they were building these 4-lane roads going right through the most historic part of the black community. And many people were really upset about that. The one city councilman who stood up against it was John Lewis. He would not play ball. They had everybody in the world calling him, pressuring him, trying to convince him to change his vote to let them do the roads. But he wouldn't. And it caused a kind of fissure with Andy Young that was never totally, I think, healed. I mean, they were friends, they respected each other, but John just would not do those kinds of compromises. He's absolutely incorruptible. Eventually, they built a 2-lane road, and it's now called the John Lewis Parkway. So he didn't have any control over that. But that's just another example of... let me tell one more story, and then I'll stop. I think back today, his his first protest. He was 16 years old. You know, he lived in rural Pike County, and he was a voracious reader from the time he was a little boy. I mean, he was really intellectual. I mean, I was stunned when I got to know him and how well read he was, and not only how smart he was, but just how intellectual he was. And he knew people didn't get that because he had a kind of a lisp, you know, had that deep South Alabama accent, and people didn't take him entirely seriously sometimes. But when he was 16, he read everything he could, and part of it was he hated farm work. His other 9 siblings were all working out in the field. He would do anything to get out of it. That's why you may have heard the story. They gave him the chickens. For 6 years he took care of the chickens, and they had 60 chickens on their farm, and he decided that's when he began to preach to the chickens. You know? And literally, he swore that they actually would sit up in attention and listen to him, and he never wanted them to sacrifice any of the chickens for a chicken dinner. He was at odds. His brothers and sisters hated the chickens. They didn't care anything about them, but Jimmy loved those chickens. But he really didn't want to spend a life of drudgery on a farm in Cotton Belt of southern Alabama. And I think it's part of the reason why he was just so devoted to scholarship, to reading. So he went to the public library, which of course was all white, only for whites. And he went up and tried to get a library card. You know, he's 16 years old, and they threw him out on his ear. Said, "Boy, what can you be thinking?" So he went and made up a petition, tried to get his classmates at the all-black school to sign it. He got a couple cousins to sign it, but nobody else would. They were scared. And so the whole thing fell apart, and his first protest was a failure. But I don't think he ever forgot it, because many years later, 1998, he published a wonderful memoir called Walking with the Wind. It's my personal favorite of all the books written on the civil rights movement. It's extraordinary. And it was the #1 bestseller in 1998. It's really a wonderful book, and there's no other, I think, autobiography from the movement quite like it. And so he's a star. You know, of course, later, you know, he did these graphic novels, which he won the National Book Award for one of them, March and Run, which was published after his death. So in 1998, he's got all this fame and top of the New York Times bestseller list, the Troy, Alabama Public Library invites him as the honored guest to give it a speech. So he said, okay, I'll do that. So he comes back to Troy, and he gets up, and the first thing he says, "I want my library card." and they gave it to him. But he, absolutely remarkable human being. I just can't say enough about him. I knew he was admirable before I started the book, but by the end of it, I knew I was dealing with someone that maybe comes along maybe once in a century, one of the greatest Americans, certainly of our time, or maybe of any time, and I miss him. Thank you.
I think these mics hopefully can pick us up okay. Can you hear us okay in the back? All right,
Is that too close? Okay? Okay.
Let me just start, and what I'd like to do is just sort of dig just a little deeper into John Lewis's personality, because obviously you spent so much time with him. There's a part in one of the critics' review of your book where you describe John Lewis as having sort of a quiet shyness. And that seems at odds with someone who is such a forceful civil rights leader. What was his true personality? Was he really a shy person? How would you describe that? And if he was, How do you reconcile his ferociousness in terms of
Well, I think
civil rights
certainly growing up, he was shy as a boy. You know, he felt like a fish out of water, you know, where he was living, and he didn't get much reinforcement for his interest in books and his dreams. I mean, he had no one in his family had ever gone to high school, and here he is talking about going to college and really having an impact on the world. So in that sense, he wasn't shy. He had a strong inner sense of himself, but in his interpersonal communications, what I was talking about there. First time I met with him in his office when I was doing the Freedom Riders book and was interviewing him, and I really didn't know what to expect. You know, he said he would give me an hour and a half. He gave me a lot more than that, and it was the beginning of a real friendship. But his warmth was extraordinary, but he's soft-spoken. You know, he's really a shouter when he speaks publicly, you know. I think in part because he's trying to overcome his speech impediment and he's trying to get people's attention. And it's not really the John Lewis I saw when he was not on a podium. You know, he was soft-spoken and a great listener. You know, in the book I talk about him as the anti-Trump. You know, he and Trump do not like each other, as I'm sure you can imagine. And he didn't have, I mean, I think he had a strong sense of self, but not in an ego way, you know. He didn't care who got credit for things. I saw him on several occasions. We'd be in a room and there'd be some people who maybe were, on the surface at least, the least important people in the room, the servers, the janitor, whoever. No, he always seemed to gravitate to them. He was always worried that they felt excluded. You know, I saw him do that several times, just make a big point of including people. You know, he didn't seem to have any class prejudice, or certainly no racial prejudice, but he was, and as I say in the book, he was not a race man in that sense. Many times he got in trouble with some people because if he thought the white candidate was better than the black candidate, he'd support the white candidate. He didn't care. He didn't really think in racial terms. In fact, his orientation from early on was not so much civil rights as it was human rights. I mean, he was really way ahead of his time in terms of being supportive of homosexuals, transgender, same-sex marriage, all those things. He was decades ahead. And it was part of this beloved community sense. He really thought everybody had a right, just like everybody else did. And he didn't cut his sails, you know, to any particular partisan ideology. I mean, you know, he was a solid Democrat, but he also knew the Democratic Party had been the party of white supremacy throughout much of its history, and they were always disappointing him. And he was even though he was friends with Bill Clinton, he was very disappointed in Clinton's second term, which he sort of had to turn himself into a Republican to get reelected. So he was very upset with the crime bill and with taking apart the welfare system. And I mean, they still remain friends, but he was very disappointed. And I think, so there's a sort of forcefulness to him, but it was not in his body language. You know, to me, I just really.
The other thing that's most impressive is his commitment to nonviolence. And if you could just sort of tell us briefly how that developed and why he was so committed to nonviolence.
Well, he first discovered it in 1956. He's 16, same year that he led the library protest. And he heard a radio sermon over the radio from Montgomery by Dr. King. And King was talking about the social gospel, which was something that John had never heard of before. The idea that a minister would focus on improving things here on earth and not just sort of pie in the sky looking to heaven. He was just exhilarated by that. And the Montgomery bus boycott, people who were, again, this was the first mass nonviolent direct action in American history at that level, an entire community refusing to ride on segregated buses. And that started it with King, and he was a close kind of apostle of King for his whole life. He was the one SNCC leader, and they were kind of the young Turks of the movement, the most radical wing of the movement in those years, who never left King. And and that's one of the reasons that he was thrown out in '66, because a lot of the SNCC kids thought King was too conservative. Some of them thought he was a phony. In the Freedom Rides, King, they pressured him to become a Freedom Rider, to get on the bus and go to Mississippi, put his body on the line. And I think if it had just been up to King, he would have done it. But all of his aides are saying, you'd be crazy. You're going to get yourself killed for nothing. The Freedom Riders need you to be out there raising money, giving speeches, They don't need one more Freedom Rider. And so he eventually succumbed to that logic. But the SNCC kids didn't, many of them never forgave him. The real split in the movement. In fact, they would refer to him mockingly as the Lord, like the Lord, that he thought he was the Lord, that he was above them. John never had any sympathy for that view. He thought King was the real deal. He loved him as much as anyone could love a person. And also, the other figure that was so important to him was Jim Lawson. I don't know how many of you have heard of Jim Lawson. He was inside the movement. He's one of the most revered figures, maybe the most revered figure. He was a kind of Gandhian intellectual, spent 3 years in India studying Gandhianism, was a conscientious objector during the Korean War, spent a year in prison, came to the South in 1956. At King's suggestion, started doing nonviolent workshops. And he set up shop finally in Nashville, where John was in college, and people like Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette and many, many others who become major figures in the movement. And Lawson just put him on fire. I mean, Lawson was an extraordinarily inspiring person. I was with him a few times. Once we recreated the Freedom Ride. We had from Nashville, part of the Freedom Ride, from Nashville to Birmingham to Montgomery. And we had 192 kids, 5 college presidents, 10 Freedom Riders, and I think a lot of these kids thought this is just going to be a weekend lark. I'm going to get out of class and I'm going to be with all these famous people and I'm going to go to Montgomery. Well, Jim Lawson had other ideas. And I'll never forget, one kid was asking him something, and Jim was an imposing figure, and he's looking down at the kid, and he says, "What are you going to do to save the world? What are you going to do?" And the kid is sort of shaking. He says, I don't know what I'm going to do." And I think Jim at that point realized he'd come on a little too strong, because later when he got a question from the mass of kids, he said, "Well, you don't all have to be full-blown activists. Just start with generosity. You can be more generous to the people that you know. A lot of good things can come from that. Not everybody can be a full-time activist." But Jim could be terrifying, and I think, but incredibly inspiring. And he was the key. The Nashville kids, the Nashville movement was the strongest movement in the country. And when the original Freedom Ride had to stop because the Klan bombed the buses and beat them up, and they had to fly to New Orleans rather than taking the bus, and that would have been the end of nonviolent direct action for a while. The kids from Nashville bailed them out, and they came down. In fact, Diane Nash, who was their leader, called and told Fred Shuttlesworth, the great Birmingham leader, said, "Fred, we're coming, 21 of us, we'll be there tomorrow." He says, "Young lady, don't you know what happened here yesterday? The Freedom Riders almost got killed. You're going to get yourself killed. Don't come." She says, "Well, we're already coming. You can't stop us. And if they hurt us, there'll just be more coming." And when I interviewed Fred Shuttlesworth about this, he said, now Diane Nash is 22 years old, and he said, "That young lady was as cool as a butcher cutting meat." That was his phrase. But
There was also a school of thought that nonviolence was not the way to go, and there's a part in your book when you talk about the rumor of Malcolm X coming to Selma, and that position that people in Selma were worried about. Can you reconcile, could you tell that story a little bit about the Malcolm X coming to town?
Well, as many of you probably know, Malcolm X went through this evolution where he really, the last 2 years of his life, he moved away from the Nation of Islam's sort of dominant orthodoxy and some of the anti-white stuff that he had subscribed to, and even accepting of violence. By the end of his life, he no longer accepted it. That's one of the reasons why he was killed, probably by Louis Farrakhan and others. But at that point, in late '64, John made his first trip to Africa. It was 3 months in Africa. It was a life-changing experience for him. And in fact, he went with a guy named Don Harris, who lives here in Sarasota. They went together. And Don was the best man at his wedding. But incredibly, they were in Kenya, in Nairobi, and they across the room they see Malcolm X. He was coming from Saudi Arabia, and so they had this whole kind of day and afternoon with Malcolm X, all discussing everything under the sun. And John came away really impressed with him. Thought, I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but this is a man of substance. And so later, when Malcolm X came to Selma, it was a real opportunity, an opening for the King faction and the Malcolm X faction to come together. And who knows what might have happened if he hadn't been assassinated in the summer of 1965, just a few weeks later. So it was difficult for John Lewis to navigate all these political waters of Black Power. He was just so determined that even if everybody else was going to leave nonviolence or true acting out his beliefs, he wasn't going to do it. And so he knew it. They probably in the end he would lose his leadership in SNCC, and he did.
Did he ever waver from his commitment from nonviolence during that period of time? Did he ever
I'll tell you the story.
Cross the line?
Yeah, well, sort of, but this will tell you about him. So it's January of 1965, and Martin Luther King is coming to Selma and to give an Emancipation Day speech. And they'd worked out where he could register in this previously all-white hotel, the main hotel in Selma, right on the river there. So they're at the registration desk, and King is about to sign up, and this notorious white supremacist Klansman just came out of nowhere and started beating Dr. King, really seriously. And John Lewis is standing right next to King. And now John was short, but he was powerful. He was really stocky and by those days, and he just wraps his arms around the Klansman and just stopped him and held him until the police came. But he later said, I didn't feel good about it. I wanted to protect Dr. King, but I was almost using force. I was almost using... He said, that's the closest I ever came to being not giving up on nonviolence. So I think if that's the worst thing you can find about him, I think he was pretty straight and narrow on the nonviolence.
Before we open it up in a few moments, we're going to open it up to some questions or comments from the audience. I'm going to ask you just some thoughts that you may or may not know about John. Obviously, he crossed paths with a lot of politicians, from John F. Kennedy to Donald Trump. Do you have any stories in terms of his feelings about certain historical political figures like Bobby Kennedy or John F. Kennedy? How did he really feel about some of them?
Well, let me just talk briefly about the Kennedys. Early on, John and all the other people in the Nashville movement they weren't particularly interested in the election of 1960. I suspect those of them who, now John wasn't old enough to vote, but those who were old enough probably more voted for Kennedy than for Nixon. I guess today is Nixon's birthday, by the way, isn't it? Yeah. He's probably rolling in his grave after what we're saying tonight. So part of the whole impetus of the Freedom Rides was that when John Kennedy gave his famous inaugural address talking about the new frontier and asked not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Talked about spreading freedom all over the world, right? Everywhere but Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. And he made sure that Dr. King was not invited to the inauguration, and made it clear that he was primarily a Cold Warrior at that point. He was much more worried about Berlin and the missile gap and all those sorts of things. And so he had to be sort of tutored, forced into this. I think Bobby Kennedy was a little bit ahead of him from the start, although he too will later say the Freedom Riders taught me almost everything I know about civil rights. I mean, he, at first, Kennedy was about to go to his first summit meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna. And the Freedom Rides happened just before that. Incredibly embarrassing. Headlines all over the world, protesters nearly murdered by the Klan because they wanted to sit in the front of a bus. Didn't exactly sound like the free world, right? And so Kennedy said famously, get your friends off those buses. He went to Harris Wofford, who was just his most liberal kind of civil rights guy in his administration. Get your friends off those buses. What are they thinking? They can't be patriotic. Are they communists? Right? They're weakening my hand here with Khrushchev. And Bobby Kennedy, the same way, tried desperately to mediate between the white supremacists. And the problem he had is that John, the governor of Alabama, was Kennedy's informal campaign manager in the South. So Kennedy had a lot of white supremacist supporters in 1960 in the South, and he didn't want to lose them, and he felt very constrained. And of course, the governor was the one who started really pushing on the Freedom Riders and making sure that they were roughed up a bit and basically chased out of Alabama. And so, but Kennedy changed. I mean, John Lewis was very skeptical of Bobby Kennedy. And he realized that John Kennedy never had enough time. He was really moving, I think, towards a pro-civil rights stance when he was assassinated. But Bobby Kennedy really did move. By 1968, he was a different person. And it's no accident that he almost begged John Lewis to come to Indianapolis to help him in that tough fight against Gene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey for the nomination.
What did he think of Lyndon Johnson?
Well, I don't think he liked him very much. I don't think he trusted him. He appreciated what he did, but at first, I think he thought Johnson was just put on the ticket to keep the South in the Democratic Party, and that he certainly wasn't anybody who was ever going to help the civil rights movement. So when he did, of course, hold fast on the Civil Rights Bill and rammed it through, probably a bill that John Kennedy never could have gotten through without Lyndon Johnson's political acumen. But they were almost immediately after the Civil Rights Act, partially because Johnson was being fed information by J. Edgar Hoover about all supposed communists in Dr. King's organization, and that Johnson moved away from King. Johnson didn't trust King, and I think, in part because of that, I think John didn't trust Johnson at all. And he was there for the signing, although actually in '64 he was helping do Freedom Summer in Mississippi at the time, and he actually did not go to that particular signing. He did go in '65 for the Voting Rights Act, but he appreciated the Great Society, but I think he doubted that Lyndon Johnson's heart was really in it. He may have been wrong about that, but from what he saw, he didn't see much.
Let's fast forward, and then we're going to open it up to questions. It's one, and it's just an issue that people have brought up. And in 2008, he took a political gamble in endorsing Obama after endorsing Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
What was his, and whether he talked to you about it, what was his rationale for that, which I'm assuming offended the Clintons, but he made that choice, which I think was a difficult choice.
It was an agonizing choice for him. It took him a long time to do it, and some of the people in Obama's orbit, for that reason, I think, never really wanted John to be in the sort of the center of the Obama world, even though Obama and John had a great relationship, respected each other enormously. You know, Obama was in the Senate for a while, and John got to know him really well and admired him, but he had a long-standing friendship with Hillary. And so he sort of implicitly endorsed her. It wasn't a formal endorsement, but everybody was clear he was fighting for her. And then as the Obama boom came, John started to waffle a bit, and he made some speeches saying, well, this Obama thing, we've never seen anything like it. It's incredible. And he didn't want to be on the wrong side of history, as he later put it. And so he, I think, maybe even against his better judgment, he switched. And Hillary never blamed him for it, actually. It's amazing. Their friendship survived. She understood what incredible pressure he was under to endorse Obama. And it's entirely possible that if John Lewis had not endorsed Obama, that Obama would not have gotten the nomination. It was that important. Because he had a big sway over black voters all over the country, in terms of getting them out to vote. Now, it's interesting, there's another book that's come out this year on John Lewis, the second biography by a man named David Greenberg, who teaches at Rutgers. It's a very fine book. He's a wonderful historian. But in his book, I think it may be the only real major distinction between his book and my book, is that he was told that not necessarily Obama himself, although it's not clear, or Obama's staff tried to put the squeeze on John Lewis by soliciting a candidate to run against him for Congress. For many years, John had no opponents. He was unbeatable in Atlanta, of course. But finally, he had a halfway serious opponent, and David claims that Obamas were really pushing him, and they were trying to force John Lewis to switch and endorse Obama. It may be my own naivete, but I don't believe it. I just know the relationship, what it developed between Obama and John. I just can't believe that Obama himself would have done that, because I think he saw Lewis as a kind of moral rock, and he certainly knew enough about John to realize that he would never give in to that kind of pressure. But so I honestly don't know what the truth is there. I'm doubtful that that's what happened. And the opposition didn't amount to anything, and John did change, and Hillary forgave him, and they had an interesting correspondence between them about, she's saying, John, I still love you. I know you had to do this. No hard feelings. It was really, both of them, I think, came out looking very, very good, I think.
And I asked this question of all authors I get. Was there anything in your research that you just, not something that you wanted to put in the book, but you found something that's unexpected or something interesting about the man? Something that surprised you about him?
Well, a couple of personal things, I guess. He didn't think he had a very good voice, so he would sort of join in the freedom songs, but he he was afraid he would ruin the chorus, but he loved to dance. He loved to dance. And there are these YouTube videos of him dancing in the halls of in the congressional office building. It's just too much, you know. And he just a lot of things that I wouldn't have thought. He was absolutely passionate about African American quilts and of art, particularly what you might call primitivist art, kind of. And I once, the Highwaymen were in Florida, these wonderful artists who did the big expressionist giant red trees, and they're wonderful. They were self-taught artists from Fort Pierce, and now their paintings are worth a lot, but they used to sell them by the highway for $10. I gave him a book on the once when I was in his office, and he was so appreciative, and he'd never heard of them, So I felt, I finally found something, something that he didn't know about. But in terms of the politics, I kept thinking, maybe there was a skeleton in the closet somewhere, right. and if I find it, I'll have to reveal it, but I hope I don't find any. And I never found any. I mean, he's too good to be true. I mean, It's just when he was elected to Congress, the New York Times ran a story where they said, well, it's great that John Lewis is coming to Congress, but he's going to have to deal with the saint problem. Everybody thinks he's a saint, and so all of his friends started calling him St. John, teasing him, all this stuff, and but he was.
He lived up to your expectations.
He really did. He really did. I wouldn't have been surprised if there were some warts along the way. And he did things sometimes people didn't like. And of course, the closest thing to controversy was when he ran against Julian Bond in 1986 for the congressional seat. They were best friends, and Julian was a heavy favorite. He was slick and handsome and well-spoken, and he, at the age of he was 28, and he was put up for the vice presidency. He wasn't even old enough to be a vice president at the Chicago Convention in '68, and but they had been dear friends for years. They would vacation together, and their wives were friends and everything. And so John was shocked actually that Julian decided, I'm going to run. I said, well, I'm going to run too, and John just outworked him. But what happened during the campaign is that Julian had started to experiment with drugs. Marijuana, probably some cocaine, and also with people on his staff. And John knew that. And what he knew mostly is that as wonderful as Julian was, and I knew Julian too, and he was wonderful, he was lazy. He was sort of too cool for school. He was just sort of, life for him was like falling off a log. He came from this really distinguished family, and John, as John once said, I love this line, he said, I'm not a showboat, I'm a tugboat.
And with that, we're going to have some questions. Julie has a mic. If you have any questions, Julie will find you.
It's a great question. He wrote a couple of books after his autobiography with kind of philosophical arguments and sort of how he felt about various things. So, in fact, I think he has a chapter called Optimism where he talks about it. And I think he felt that you sort of got to choose optimism or pessimism. I mean, maybe you try to find a balance somewhere in the middle, but he always, hope was an incredibly important concept to him. that you can't lose hope. That if you lose hope, it's sort of all over. And I'm sure you know that line. I think your organization's based on that, isn't it? About the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Well, in some way, I think he believed that. Maybe he had no reason to believe it, considering all the terrible things that happened to him, but he persevered. I mean, he lived to be 80 years old. Became one of the most influential Americans of the 20th century. He had no reason really to think that would happen, but he did. He never gave up on anything, you know. I mean, he was just. That was in some ways symptomatic of a lot of the people in the movement. That they had to be optimistic to keep going. There's some wonderful stories out of Parchman Prison in the summer of 1961 when they put over 300 Freedom Riders in there. And the guards and Ross Barnett, the racist governor of Mississippi, and probably even the Kennedys thought, you know, we put these guys in a real prison, they're going to start crying to go home to their mothers and fathers, you know, when they see what it's like in a real prison. And exactly the opposite happened. They turned Parchman Prison into a university of nonviolence. I mean, the more the guards would harass them, the more the freedom songs they'd sing all night, you know, driving the guards crazy. Why are you people so happy? Your lives are miserable. Why do you keep singing those songs? In fact, that's Bull Connor, you know, of course, the commissioner of public safety in Birmingham. He got so sick of the freedom songs when he arrested the Freedom Riders in Birmingham. In the middle of the night, he came and rounded them all up and drove them to the Tennessee line and left them off. Said, go back to Tennessee. I hope I never hear another freedom song. And so one of them, a wonderful woman, Catherine Brooks, who just died a few weeks ago. What a pistol she was. As Bull Connor is driving off, well, first of all, she sat next to him in the car, and she said, I'll cook breakfast for you, you know. She's very pretty and saucy, and she was just doing this banter, and as she later said, I wasn't scared of him, you know. Why would we be scared of Bull? And but as Bull Connor is riding off in the darkness of the morning, she yells, I'll be back in Birmingham by high noon. She loved the movie High Noon. That was why that was the reference, okay? So she didn't make it by noon, but by about 2 o'clock they were back. They got a car to come from Nashville. They drove him back, and Bull Connor walks into the crowd, and there he sees her, Catherine, and she goes, like that. And they started singing freedom songs. It's not surprising he went to an early grave.
Do we have one or two more questions? Somebody raise your hand.
Did John Lewis ever get back together with his parents after disappointing them by being arrested?
He did. That's an interesting story. For a while, I think his family felt endangered. He was such a public figure. You know, he was like a marked man for the Klan and the White Citizens Council. And there was reason to worry that they would lose their farm. You know, they might be night riders. That didn't happen, but so they felt they didn't quite understand for a number of years why he cared so much about this. That he would even put he professed to love his family, and he did. I mean, he later in life, I mean, he talked about his family and tears come in his eyes, really. I mean, he loved his family. They never saw eye to eye in those years, although now I've gotten to know the brothers a bit, and oh my God, you just don't see brothers revering another brother the way they revere him. We were at a session in the Freedom Rides Museum in Montgomery, and one of his brothers, who's he's still a farmer, you know, he's kind of a rugged guy, and he started crying, talking about John. You know, he just, it amazed me, really. I mean, he just, because he has this kind of tough exterior, but So John's chief of staff told me, he was his chief of staff for 20 years, he said, wherever John went in the world, he took Pike County with him. He took his home with him. That he was always sort of proud of being from there. You know, in some ways it was an awful place for blacks to live, but it was his home, you know, and he really had an affection for sort of the folk culture. I mean, the music and the food, you know, he was absolutely obsessed with sweet potato pie, which his family would make, you know. And there are these wonderful pictures of him on these porch swings with his mother, you know. And so I don't think they ever quite understood why he was so determined, that he devoted his whole life to this. I think maybe they do now, you know, the younger siblings. They've started a John Lewis Foundation in Troy, and they're doing a lot of really good work there. And so he was able to work it out, but there was a time early on when he went to American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville, and he was very disappointed in that first year because nobody was interested in the social gospel, you know, and there was no NAACP branch on the campus. So he went to the president and he said, I want to start a branch. And the president said, you can't do that. Our whole funding comes from the white United Methodist Church. If they hear you do this, we'll be dead. And he was so discouraged by this that he couldn't get any of the fellow students to think about these questions. He said, well, I'm going to transfer to Troy. Just like Osprey and Lucy tried to do at the University of Alabama, and James Meredith at the University of Mississippi, I'm going to break the color bar at Troy. And so he writes Dr. King and sets up a meeting, and he goes to Montgomery and meets with Ralph Abernathy and King and Fred Gray, their attorney. And the first thing King says, so you're the boy from Troy. He became known as the boy from Troy. One of my chapters is named that. But it was King who came up with that. And they tried to convince him how tough it was going to be, how much pressure would be brought to bear on his family. People might get hurt if he followed through with this to try to get in to break the color line at Troy. Probably couldn't have done it anyway. They wouldn't have. So he went and talked to his family, and for 24 hours they agreed. John, if that's what you want to do, we'll support you. But then the next morning, reality set in, and they said, John, please don't do this. We've got 9 other children. I shudder to think what will happen. This becomes a big deal, and you're trying to challenge the Jim Crow structure in that way. And so he agreed, and he went back. And fortunately, that's when Jim Lawson came in to Nashville and changed the whole cultures. All of a sudden, everybody was talking about the social gospel at American Baptist, and it completely changed and became the center of the movement. But he almost left because of that. Ironically, today, I think it was 2 years ago, they put up a wonderful historical marker at where his original boyhood farm had been, way out in the sticks in Pike County. And I was lucky to be able to be there with his brothers and his nieces and nephews and lots of wonderful people. And then we had a big reception at Troy University. And to get to the reception, we went right by John Lewis Hall. Most beautiful building on our campus is John Lewis Hall. But of course, he wasn't allowed to go there, and it wasn't even, couldn't even apply. But I guess it's better than the alternative.
Hey, Dr. Arsenault, you end your book with an excerpt from an essay that John Lewis wrote shortly before his death. So before we conclude, I'm going to read a portion of that, and then I'd like your final thoughts and message to the students that are going to be retracing some of his steps. So he writes this, and it reads, quote, "Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love, and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom reign. So with that, any concluding comments about John and any message to the students who are going to see some of the things that John saw and experienced?
Well, you know, the most amazing thing about that piece is that he was incredibly weak when he wrote it. I don't know how he got through it just a couple days before he died. You know, in fact, he just had this incredible will. A couple days before that, he got up enough strength, last time before he went into the hospital for good, to go out to the Black Lives Matter Plaza, you know, just north of the White House, and to, it's incredible. I have the picture in the book. Of course, it's COVID, so he's got the mask on and everything, and he was dead within 2 weeks. But I mean, how do you do that? You know, of course, his family. He had an adopted son who adores him, and he adored, who became a rap musician. We wasn't sure about that, you know. But and his wife was dead. He was very close to Lillian, and so. But he had a lot of other people to think about. Yet he's somehow thinking about this legacy. What he could leave one more part of this legacy to somehow inspire a few more people to keep up the struggle. And so I don't know. I think it's an object lesson for all of us. You know, and he seemed to know what was important.
Okay. With that, we are going to conclude this. Let's have a round of applause for Dr. Arsenault.
Thank you. Thank you.
And if you'll bear with us, Julie's going to make a couple of announcements before we go.
Thank you, Dr. Arsenault, Judge Williams. We are going to run and set up the book table so that Dr. Arsenault can sign books, and you will have an opportunity to chat with him. Thank you again for coming tonight. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay. So, yep, thank